Hey Team Bio. Okay, so today's screencast is on types of selection. So, where are my notes? Okay, right here. So in class yesterday, I had you take that little conceptual inventory, and really impressed with your work there and your understanding already of evolution and the importance to note that differences or mutations arise by chance, and then natural selection acts on the phenotypes or the range of phenotypes that are already present in a population. So I think that most of the information that I communicate to you today will be pretty intuitive, but it's worth going over regardless. Okay, so there are 4 different types of selection that I'm going to be showing you today, and the first one is called directional selection. Okay, so within directional selection, I guess for each of these, we're going to create a graph. And this graph is going to be on the y-axis. It's the number of individuals. I'll just say number of ind. Okay, so that's the number of individuals, and then on the x-axis is the range of phenotypes. And let's just pick, we can just say this is small, and this is large. And if we're to look at any population, make this a little closer, there's going to be some sort of bell-type curve, and we see individuals. This represents the number of individuals, right? So say this is 100,000. So most people, or no, these aren't people, let's say these are, I don't know, frogs. Most frogs are of a certain size, a middling size, but there are some frogs that we see that are small, and some frogs that are large, but most frogs are somewhere in the middle. Okay, so this is the overall graph that we're going to be working with. But first, I'm going to actually erase this and redraw a slightly different curve. So I guess if we're talking about the size of frogs, which I just made up, but that's fine. Let's say the range of phenotypes that we see is something like this. So most frogs are kind of middling small. A type of directional selection would be over time, if this black curve is equal to T1, and this blue curve is equal to time 2, say it's like 10,000 years later, we might see the distribution of frogs to look something like this. So over time, we see larger and larger frogs in the population, and now the mean frog is about this size right here. So let me pop up another example of that for you. Okay, so here we have an example of cacti and over time. So if you see here, this initial kind of faded out curve represents the number of spines present on cacti, and most cacti have about 90 spines on them. But over time, let's say a wild boar kind of migrates into the area where these cacti live, we start to see that the cacti that have fewer spines get eaten by the wild boar. And the cacti that have the most spines boars don't like spines, they get in their teeth and their tongue, so they avoid those really spiny cacti and they only go for the fewer spine cacti. So we start to see a shift in the range of phenotypes within this cacti population, and now the average cactus has about 110 spines on it, up from 90 initially. So this would be an example of directional selection, when a phenotype is pushed in a certain way. And you can imagine here, like with our frog example, we have now larger frogs, or a population of frogs that are on average larger than before, but it could have gone the other way. We could see even smaller frogs. So directional selection could happen in either direction. It just depends on the environmental pressures in the area. Okay, so that's the first type of selection. The second type of selection is called stabilizing selection. Okay. And I'm going to grab this graph again. And paste it down here. And then erase this stuff. Shit, I keep erasing my axes. Okay, so stabilizing selection would look something like this. Say we have again, a range of phenotypes within a population. That looks something like this. And if you go up to this graph here, you'll notice that our curve, our new curve under stabilizing selection, is much more broad than our initial curve. So there are a lot more individuals that reside under this part of the curve and this part of the curve. We have a lot of individuals that are very small and a lot of individuals that are very large. So stabilizing selection is when we start to select for or favor only individuals that have the middling phenotype. So over time, our curve will start to look something more like this. So now we've eliminated the very small and the very large individuals from the population, and only the individuals with kind of the middle characteristic have survived and reproduced. So our curve has compressed. And I think you can understand pretty intuitively why this is called stabilizing selection. So I'll show you an example of that. Okay, so here's a mouse population that's showing stabilizing selection. So let's imagine that these mice are living in an environment that's becoming more arid over time and more sandy. So this potentially means that the mice that are really white and the mice that are really dark stick out on this kind of golden colored sand, and only the mice that are these golden sandy color, they survive the best, and so therefore they reproduce the best in this environment. So this is when we would start to see something like stabilizing selection occur. Okay, so that's 2 of the 4. The next type of selection is called disruptive selection, and I think you can guess what it's going to look like. And then let's grab our graph again. Okay, so disruptive selection is kind of the inverse of stabilizing selection. So if we have a population at T1, then over time, we start to see that instead of the middling phenotype, or the average phenotype, being selected for, it's actually selected against. So our curve starts to look something like this. We get a double humped or peaked curve. So now we have a bunch of individuals at time 2 that have the more small phenotype and a bunch of individuals with the larger phenotype, and all or most of the individuals with the intermediate phenotype are now gone. And so this is, I think you can see pretty quickly, this is a type of selection that will lead to speciation. Eventually, if this disruptive selection keeps occurring, where these guys are selected against, this population of individuals right here and this population of individuals right here will start to become two distinct species. We're going to talk about what it means to be a species. You think it might be kind of simple to define a species, but it's actually more complicated than you can imagine. Or yes, maybe. But you can imagine it's complicated. Okay, so I'll give you an example of disruptive selection. Okay, so here are some finch populations here. If we can imagine these birds were all of the same species originally, you can see here how over time we see the width of the lower bill changing among the birds. And this might be because, so having a really small lower width bill is better for, taking out seeds from a small pine tree. I don't know, I just made that up. And the larger width bill is better for cracking nuts. So the individuals with the intermediate phenotype are not very good at either of these two food gathering strategies, and so they get selected against. However, the individuals with the small or with the large are better, and so we see those individuals we see these two distinct populations start to emerge. Okay, and that is an example, again, of disruptive selection. Okay, the last type of selection is actually a type of directional selection, but I'm going to separate it out because I think it's important for you to consider it potentially its own category, and it's sexual selection. So sexual selection is, of course, you've seen from what you've done with courtship videos, it's usually the males develop or have these showy characteristics. And this is a type of what's called runaway selection. Because here's how it happens. A male with a showy characteristic is born. Females prefer that showy characteristic, so they start to choose that male or those males to be their mates. And so more offspring are left behind with these same showy characteristics, and the selection, it just ramps up and you get crazier and crazier phenotypes. And the mating displays become more and more and more extreme as the females get more selective. And they're only choosing the males with the craziest displays. And the males that don't have the crazy displays don't get a chance to mate. So this can lead to something which is called sexual dimorphism. And sexual dimorphism is when the females and males have different characteristics or phenotypes. So, for example, I'll just give you a picture. So here's an example of sexual dimorphism. We see that these males, male lions, have a huge mane, and they're also much larger than the females of the same species. Okay, so, where was I going with this? So yeah, this is a type of directional selection, so females are choosy and they're only selecting the males that are the biggest with the biggest manes and can run the fastest, yada yada yada. And we also see this, like, for example, in peacocks, the males with the showiest tails. But it's a very specific type of sexual or of directional selection, which is why I wanted to tease it out. Female preference is driving the course of evolution of the species, which is different than kind of environmental pressures driving the same type of selection. Okay, so these are the 3 different types of selection, or sorry, 4 different types of selection, or I guess I should say like 3.5. And yes, get excited because tomorrow in class we are going to see natural selection in action. Dun dun dun.